blood on stone, a scream cut short, a whisper that no one could explain. This was not a battlefield, not a church, not even a home. It was the birth of something far stranger, a place designed to save souls, yet destined to break them. Imagine walking into a building that promised redemption but delivered silence so absolute it drove men to madness. That was Eastern State Penitentiary, and its story begins in the most unsettling way possible. The year was 1829. In Philadelphia, the cradle of American democracy, lawmakers and reformers gathered with a bold, almost utopian idea. They would reinvent punishment. No longer would prisoners be tossed together in chaos, fighting, scheming, learning darker lessons from one another. Instead, each soul would be placed in isolation, given nothing but a Bible and 4 stone walls. Through solitude and prayer, crime itself could be cured. It was not meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a machine for moral rebirth. The architecture was the sermon. Eastern State rose from the ground like a Gothic cathedral to discipline. High fortress walls, spiked battlements, and a central rotunda from which 7 long corridors radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. From the air, it looked less like a prison and more like a dark sun, its rays stretching in every direction, each corridor ending in silence. Every prisoner was to be kept alone, cloaked in a hood when leaving the cell, stripped of human contact. The design was radical, the philosophy revolutionary. Reformers called it the Pennsylvania system. Critics would one day call it torture. Step inside one of those first cells. The ceiling curves into a vaulted arch with a single narrow skylight known as the Eye of God. Light spills down onto bare stone, a reminder that only heaven watches. The heavy wooden door seals shut behind you, and for 23 hours a day you are alone. No voice, no laughter, not even the sound of chains. Just silence. Silence so deep that the scrape of your own breath becomes unbearable. Reformers believed that silence was sacred. Prisoners began to believe it was a curse. It is hard for us, nearly 2 centuries later, to imagine how radical Eastern State truly was. At its opening, the prison was hailed as the most advanced institution of its kind in the world. Delegations traveled from Europe, studying its halls and praising its innovation. Charles Dickens himself visited, walking the endless stone corridors. Yet even Dickens, no stranger to human misery, left horrified. He called the system slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain. And here lies the paradox. Eastern State was born not from cruelty, but from idealism. Its creators wanted to heal. Instead, they built a labyrinth of isolation where whispers seemed to rise from the very walls. The prison became a monument to human ambition colliding with human fragility. It was not long before stories began to circulate, stories of men who lost their minds in the silence, who swore they heard footsteps outside their locked doors, who whispered back to voices that no one else could hear. This was only the beginning. The vision of redemption had been sealed in iron and stone, but inside, something far darker had awakened. And as the years passed, the line between punishment and torment blurred until it vanished completely. So ask yourself, what happens to a place built on hope when its foundations are soaked in despair? The answer waits, echoing down the first corridor of Eastern State Penitentiary, and it will only get stranger from here. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Prisoners at Eastern State were locked in their cells 23 hours a day, their only company a Bible, a bucket, and their own thoughts. When they were let out for exercise, their heads were covered with heavy hoods so they could not see one another. The corridors were designed for silence, the guards trained to move like shadows. Every brick, every lock, every ritual of this prison was meant to erase human connection. Reformers celebrated it as progress. The men inside felt it as slow-motion death. Imagine sitting alone for days, weeks, months, and years without hearing another human voice. No laughter, no argument, no comfort, not even the sound of footsteps approaching your door. The Pennsylvania system, as it was called, believed that solitude would lead to reflection, that reflection would lead to repentance, and that repentance would lead to redemption. But human minds do not bend that way. They break. Whispers began to circulate, both inside and outside the walls. Guards spoke of inmates who clawed at their own skin, muttering to voices no one else could hear. Men rocked back and forth in their cells until their bodies gave out. Some refused food, convinced they were being poisoned. Others laughed hysterically at nothing, filling the corridors with manic echoes. More than one prisoner begged to be whipped, claiming that physical pain would be easier to bear than the crushing silence. Reformers, sitting in their polished offices, declared the system a success. Statistics showed fewer escapes, fewer riots, fewer outward acts of violence. To them, the numbers proved the theory. But the reality inside the cells told another story entirely. Insanity was spreading like a hidden infection, seeping into every corner of the radial wings. Charles Dickens's visit in 1842 remains one of the most damning accounts. He had come to America curious about its great experiment in prison reform. What he found at Eastern State horrified him. Inmates, he wrote, were buried alive in stone coffins, subjected to a punishment worse than physical torment. I hold this slow, daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. Dickens saw clearly what the reformers refused to admit. The system was breaking men, not saving them. Yet the prison continued to expand. More wings were added, more cells built, more inmates swallowed into the labyrinth. Each corridor was a mirror of the next, endless rows of heavy wooden doors with tiny eye slits, the same patch of light from the eye of God skylight overhead. Walking those halls even today feels like stepping into a dream you cannot wake from. A dream where time does not move and sound does not exist. By the mid-19th century, Eastern State was already infamous. It was called a wonder of the modern world, studied by foreign governments, copied by dozens of prisons across Europe and America. Yet it was also whispered about in darker terms. Visitors claimed they felt watched, as though unseen eyes lingered in the shadows. Workers spoke of sudden chills, of voices that seemed to seep out of the stone itself. The prison was a paradox, hailed as humane innovation, lived as torment. And so the experiment marched on, cell by cell, life by life, building a legacy of pain that reformers chose not to see. But the walls remembered. The corridors absorbed every scream, every whisper, every broken thought. What began as a vision of hope was already curdling into legend, one where silence itself became the cruelest punishment of all. Because in Eastern State, silence was never empty. It was alive, and those who sat in it too long swore they were not alone. The prison kept growing. New wings branched out from the central hub like the bones of some vast stone creature, swallowing hundreds more men into its cold embrace. What had once been a radical experiment was becoming a sprawling labyrinth of misery, each corridor stretching farther, each cell a tiny tomb for the living. Eastern State was no longer just a prison. It was a city of silence, built on despair. The cells themselves were barely larger than coffins. A narrow doorway, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron, a slit for food, and that single skylight overhead. To the outside world, these chambers were signs of order and progress. To the men locked inside, they were graves, burial vaults for people who still breathed. Every corridor lined with identical doors felt like a mausoleum, row after row of lives sealed away, forgotten. Guards patrolled the radial wings, their footsteps echoing endlessly down the stone floors. At night, though, the silence was never complete. Strange noises disturbed the stillness. A heavy knock from inside an empty cell, a sudden cry that cut through the darkness, followed by absolute quiet. Some guards admitted they dreaded the late shifts, when the corridors seemed too long, the shadows too thick, and the air too cold for comfort. Reports circulated among staff, doors that rattled as if someone were trying to break free, even when the cells were vacant. Whispers drifting through the air, impossible to trace. The clanging of unseen chains dragging across the floors. More than one guard swore they saw figures moving at the far end of a hallway, dark shapes slipping back into the walls when approached. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, nerves sharpened by endless silence. But those who worked here long enough all came to the same conclusion. The prison itself was watching. Philadelphia took notice. The city that had once celebrated Eastern State as a beacon of progress now whispered about it as a place of torment. Locals spoke of the moans carried on the wind, of the strange chill that lingered near its walls even in summer. It became a landmark of dread, a fortress not only of stone but of suffering. Children were warned not to wander too close. Mothers told stories of ghosts pacing behind the barred windows. Inside, life grew harsher as the decades passed. Overcrowding stripped away the ideals of solitary confinement, but the architecture still pressed its weight on every man. Long corridors stretched like veins, feeding despair from one block to the next. Even when the silence broke, when prisoners were forced to share cells, when fights and riots erupted, the old design still held. The place itself still spoke the language of isolation. Visitors who stepped inside often left unsettled. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of stone and iron. The acoustics were unnatural. A single cough could travel the length of a corridor, distorted and ghostly. The very design that was meant to enforce silence now amplified fear. Every sound felt wrong, every shadow stretched too far. Eastern State was transforming into something its creators never intended. It was not just a prison, but a monument of pain. A place where every stone seemed to remember the cries of the men it confined. A place where guards and prisoners alike felt an invisible presence pressing down on them. By the mid-19th century, the legends had already begun. Whispers in the city told of men driven mad by solitude, of spirits that lingered long after their bodies were gone. The prison's reputation grew darker with every passing year. It was no longer simply a machine for justice. It had become a house of echoes, a fortress where every wall had seen too much, and every corridor carried the weight of what it could never forget. And as the walls absorbed these stories, something deeper began to stir. Because in Eastern State Penitentiary, nothing ever truly stayed behind bars. Not all the men locked inside Eastern State were forgotten. Some of them were infamous, their names splashed across newspapers, their faces etched into America's memory. And when they were sent here, the prison itself became part of their legend. In 1929, one of the most notorious figures in the country walked through its gates, Al Capone, the king of Chicago's underworld, the man who had built an empire on bootlegging, gambling, and blood. Eastern State should have swallowed him like every other inmate, one more life sealed behind iron doors. But Capone was no ordinary prisoner. His cell did not look like the barren stone chambers of the rest. Visitors today still stop and stare when they see the photographs. Capone's room was furnished with carpets, a polished desk, a radio, even a lamp that cast warm light on the cold walls. It looked more like a gentleman's study than a prison cell. Yet even with these luxuries, Capone was not at peace. Rumors spread among guards and fellow inmates that he was haunted, tormented not by the law, but by the ghost of James Clark, one of the men slaughtered in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. At night, Capone was heard screaming, shouting at shadows, begging someone to leave him alone. Guards claimed he carried on conversations with no one, his voice echoing down the corridor. Some swore they heard him weeping in his cell, the great gangster reduced to terror by something unseen. Whether it was guilt, madness, or something darker that stalked him in the silence of Eastern State, no one could say. But the whispers endured. Even Al Capone could not escape the ghosts of his past. He was not the only legend to walk these halls. Willie Sutton, the dapper bank robber known as Slick Willie, was another of Eastern State's famous inmates. Sutton was a master of disguise, a man who once escaped prison by dressing as a guard. He spent decades in and out of cells across America, but Eastern State may have been his greatest stage. In 1945, Sutton and a group of inmates carried out one of the most daring escape attempts in the prison's history. Using spoons, chisels, and sheer determination, they dug a tunnel beneath the massive stone walls. For weeks they burrowed in secret, carving their way toward freedom. When the escape finally came, Sutton slipped into the earth and vanished into the city beyond. For a brief moment, the legend was real. Eastern State's walls had been breached. But like so many others, Sutton's freedom was short-lived. He was caught again, dragged back inside, his story absorbed into the myth of the prison. These men were not just criminals. They were characters in America's darkest folklore, symbols of power, rebellion, greed, and defiance. By housing them, Eastern State became more than a prison. It became a theater of notoriety, a place where history's villains played out their final acts under the crushing weight of silence. And their presence left more than stories. Visitors claim Capone's old cell still carries a strange heaviness, a feeling that the room remembers his fear. Guides speak of footsteps in the corridor outside, of voices murmuring in the dark, as if the gangster's endless arguments with unseen tormentors continue long after his death. Sutton's legend, too, lingers in whispers of tunnels and shadows, as though the prison itself recalls the audacity of the men who tried to escape its grasp. Every infamous inmate left a mark. Every tale added a brick to the mythology of Eastern State. The walls did not just hold bodies. They absorbed reputations, fears, and the restless energy of men who were larger than life. And in doing so, the prison itself grew larger than life, a fortress not only of punishment, but of legend. But fame could not disguise the truth. Behind every headline, behind every name, the same silence waited. The same stone corridors pressed in, and the same whispers haunted the night. The glamour of infamous names could not disguise the slow decay. By the mid-20th century, Eastern State Penitentiary was unraveling. What had once been a model of discipline and silence was now collapsing under its own weight. The population swelled far beyond capacity. Cells designed for one man now crammed in two, sometimes three. The system of isolation, once its defining principle, broke apart in the chaos of overcrowding. The silence was gone. In its place came noise, constant, unrelenting noise. The clatter of iron doors, the clash of fists, the cries of men beaten, desperate, raging against walls that no longer contained their fury. Guards patrolled with clubs and rifles, but control was slipping away. Eastern State was no longer an experiment in reform. It had become a battlefield. Riots tore through the blocks. Inmates set fires, destroyed doors, smashed windows. They refused to be silent, refused to remain broken. One of the most violent uprisings came in the 1930s, when prisoners took over sections of the prison, forcing guards to retreat and call in reinforcements. Another erupted in the 1960s, fueled by anger at brutal conditions and neglect. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the pounding of boots as state police stormed the walls. Cells cracked under the strain. Wooden doors splintered, stone crumbled, locks shattered. The perfect geometry of the radial design, once hailed as the architecture of moral order, now looked like ruins under siege. Inmates carved messages into the walls, scratched names into the iron doors, left behind marks of rebellion that still scar the stone today. Survival replaced every other idea. Men fought over scraps of food, traded violence for safety, built alliances to endure. The dream of solitude as a path to redemption had long since collapsed. Now it was the law of the jungle, played out in echoing corridors under the cold gaze of the Rotunda Tower. Guards spoke of walking the halls at night and feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes watching from the darkness. Some admitted the prison no longer felt human. It was alive, seething, a beast made of stone and suffering. The stories grew darker. Inmates claimed they heard voices when they tried to sleep, whispers that slid between the cracks in the stone. Guards dismissed it as paranoia, until they began to hear the same things. Heavy knocks from sealed cells, footsteps trailing just behind them in empty corridors, sudden screams that seemed to erupt from nowhere. The building itself had become a chorus of despair, every wall vibrating with anger and grief. Philadelphia no longer saw Eastern State as a marvel. It was an eyesore, a fortress of chaos looming in the heart of the city. Locals crossed the street rather than walk beside its massive walls. They spoke of the smell of smoke drifting from inside, of sirens in the night, of the terrible sense that the prison was consuming itself from within. By the late 20th century, Eastern State was a place of desperation. Its ideals were dust, its reputation a shadow of horror. The men inside no longer sat in quiet reflection. They shouted, fought, clawed, and cursed, their voices colliding in endless waves that cracked against the stone. The silence was dead. Only despair remained. And as the chaos deepened, the walls themselves seemed to groan, as though straining under the weight of all they had witnessed. The cold stone cracked not just with age, but with memory. And in those cracks, whispers took root. Whispers that would outlast the prisoners, the guards, and even the prison itself. By 1971, it was over. After nearly a century and a half of confinement, chaos, and collapse, Eastern State Penitentiary finally closed its gates. The grand experiment was dead. The prisoners were transferred out, the guards walked away, and the silence returned. But it was not the same silence the reformers had imagined in 1829. This silence was heavier, darker. It carried the weight of every scream, every riot, every broken life sealed behind those walls. The prison stood abandoned, a hollow shell looming in the middle of Philadelphia. The fortress-like walls, once meant to inspire awe and fear, now looked like the ruins of some medieval castle. Ivy crept up the stone. Rust ate through the bars. Inside, the cells sat empty, the wooden doors hanging loose on their hinges. Sunlight pierced through broken skylights, slicing the dust into golden shafts that fell onto floors littered with debris. The air smelled of mildew, stone, and memory. Journalists who slipped inside after the closure tried to capture what they felt, but their words all circled the same unsettling truth. It's like someone is walking just behind you, one reporter confessed, describing the sensation of unseen footsteps in corridors where no one else stood. Photographers spoke of the oppressive atmosphere, the sense that the walls themselves were watching. Even in daylight, the prison seemed alive, every shadow carrying menace. Explorers described the endless corridors as dreamlike and distorted. You could walk for minutes and feel you had gone nowhere at all. The radial design, meant to symbolize divine order, now felt disorienting, a trap that funneled you deeper into silence. The cells were stripped bare, yet each one seemed to hum with memory. One journalist wrote that standing in the middle of the rotunda felt like being in the chest cavity of some dead giant, empty but still echoing with breath. For the city of Philadelphia, Eastern State became more than an abandoned building. It became a ghost. Locals whispered about strange lights flickering through the broken windows at night. Some swore they heard voices drifting from the walls when they walked past. Children dared one another to press their ears to the stone, convinced they would hear whispers of men who had died inside. The prison was closed, but it refused to rest. In the years after 1971, artists, historians, and urban explorers found their way into the decaying fortress. They all left with the same impression. This was not just an empty ruin. It was a place where the past still clung like a shadow. Paint peeled from the walls in jagged strips, like skin tearing away. Iron bars were twisted, corroded, bent as if by invisible hands. And always, the sound, the creak of metal, the groan of stone, the faint suggestion of footsteps following just out of sight. The legend of Eastern State as a haunted place was born in this silence. Not from horror movies, not from ghost tours, but from the raw, unsettling feeling of being there. Visitors did not need to be told ghost stories. They felt them. The prison radiated dread, a presence too heavy to dismiss. It was no longer a penitentiary. It had become something else entirely, a monument of despair, a cathedral of absence, a shell that still breathed. And so a new chapter began. Eastern State was no longer a prison for the living. It was a prison for memory, for whispers, for the restless energy of everything its walls had witnessed. The gates were locked, the keys thrown away. But inside, the silence deepened, and with it, the legend of a ghost prison waiting for its next witness. By the 1980s, the silence of abandonment had transformed into something stranger. The prison stood empty of inmates, but not of presence. Researchers, journalists, and curious explorers who dared to step inside began to leave with the same unsettling stories. They didn't just see a ruin. They felt it. An invisible weight pressing on their shoulders, a prickling on the back of the neck, the undeniable sense that they were not alone. The whispers were the first, faint, almost inaudible, drifting down the long stone corridors. Visitors swore they heard voices calling from empty cells, low murmurs, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sorrow, always impossible to pin down. Tourists described turning their heads sharply, convinced someone was standing right behind them, only to find nothing but crumbling walls. In the cell blocks, the echoes carried strangely, bouncing back in ways that felt deliberate, as if the building itself was speaking. Then came the figures, shadows moving across doorways when no one else was near, pale outlines flickering in the corners of vision, dissolving when approached. One photographer reported seeing a man in a dark cap, standing at the far end of a corridor. He raised his camera, snapped the shot, and when he lowered the lens, the figure was gone. The developed photo showed nothing but stone. Guards assigned to watch over the property after its closure confessed that nighttime patrols were unbearable. More than one admitted they refused to walk the halls alone. They told of footsteps following them, slow and deliberate, matching their pace step for step. Doors slammed in the distance without explanation. Lights flickered even when the electricity was cut. Some guards resigned altogether, unwilling to face the dread that came with each shift. Word began to spread. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, drawn by its sinister reputation. Eastern State quickly became a magnet for ghost hunters, each hoping to capture evidence of what countless witnesses already believed. Teams brought in cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic sensors, filling the cold stone corridors with their equipment. What they left with only deepened the mystery. Tapes filled with disembodied voices, photographs streaked with strange light, and recordings of pounding noises from cells that had been locked for decades. For locals, the prison's reputation shifted from a historical relic to something more alive and more terrifying. Children who once told ghost stories outside its walls now dared each other to sneak inside. Visitors described a living silence, heavy and unnatural, that seemed to pulse like breath. The fortress no longer felt abandoned. It felt inhabited, but not by the living. By the end of the decade, Eastern State had already earned its place among America's most haunted landmarks. Its vast halls, once a monument to reform, were now a theater of shadows. Every whisper, every footstep, every fleeting figure in the dark added another layer to its legend. The prison was dead, but its ghosts were very much awake. Some places inside Eastern State feel strange the moment you enter them, as if the air itself changes. Even the most skeptical visitors admit it. Paranormal investigators call them hotspots, but to those who have walked the halls at night, they feel more like wounds in the fabric of time, places where the past refuses to let go. Cell Block 12 is the most infamous. Long and narrow, it stretches out like a tunnel into shadow. The walls are cracked, the iron doors rusted, and the light that filters through feels thinner here, as though the sun itself avoids it. Visitors often report seeing dark figures moving in the corners, slipping from one doorway to the next. Some describe faces peering out of cell windows, faces pale, indistinct, and gone in an instant. Guards once claimed they heard entire conversations drifting through the block, low voices murmuring as if prisoners were still gathered together. But when they checked each cell, every one was empty. Then there is Cell Block 6. The atmosphere here is different, not just shadows, but sound. Deep groans echo down the corridor, rising suddenly and vanishing without explanation. Investigators have captured audio of moans and cries that seem to come from inside the walls themselves. Visitors have described the overwhelming sensation of sadness pressing on their chests, like the block itself is grieving. Some say the groans are not human at all, but something older, the stone itself crying out after centuries of confinement. And above it all looms the Central Guard Tower, the watchful eye of Eastern State. From its heights, guards once monitored the entire prison, able to see down every corridor at once. Today it is silent, its stairways rotted, its windows clouded with dust. Yet countless witnesses claim to hear footsteps pacing inside, the shuffle of boots on stone, the scrape of metal against floor. Tour guides have reported whispers in the tower, as though orders are still being given from the shadows above. Some even swear they've heard the faint jingle of keys, the sound of a guard making rounds that ended decades ago. It isn't just human figures that haunt these halls. Stories persist of spectral dogs, phantoms of the guard animals once kept inside the prison to patrol the grounds. Visitors have seen their shapes darting through the shadows, heard the growl of unseen throats, or felt the brush of fur against their legs when no animal was there. Some claim these loyal guardians never left their posts, pacing the walls of Eastern State just as their masters once did. Each hotspot tells its own story. Cell Block 12 whispers of shadows that never fade. Cell Block 6 mourns with groans that rise from nowhere. The tower above the rotunda still carries the footsteps of watchmen who refuse to rest. Together, they form a map of fear within the prison, each point a reminder that Eastern State is not empty. It is layered with presence, with fragments of lives and duties that continue long after death. To walk these halls is to step into a place where time has stopped. The cells remain, the corridors stretch on, the tower watches from above. But what you feel most is not the architecture. It is the weight of memory pressing down, whispering, moving in the corner of your vision. Eastern State is not simply haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by everything it once was, and by everything it refuses to release. Today, Eastern State is no longer a place of punishment, but of pilgrimage. The crumbling fortress has transformed into one of Philadelphia's most visited landmarks, a museum by day, a stage of fear by night. Tourists walk through the decayed cell blocks, their footsteps crunching on the same stone floors that once echoed with chains. Sunlight spills through collapsed ceilings, illuminating rusted doors and graffiti left by decades of abandonment. Guides lead visitors past Capone's cell, the infamous tunnels, the endless corridors where shadows still linger. The prison has become a living exhibit, both a monument to reform and a mausoleum of suffering. But when the sun goes down, the atmosphere shifts. The air grows colder, the shadows stretch longer, and the prison takes on a second life. Nighttime ghost tours plunge visitors into darkness, where whispers and footsteps seem closer than ever. And then there is the spectacle that made Eastern State famous in modern times: terror behind the walls. Every autumn, the prison becomes the stage for one of the largest haunted attractions in America. Actors in grotesque costumes prowl the cell blocks. Strobe lights flash against the ruined walls. Smoke and screams fill the corridors as thousands of thrill-seekers pour through the gates. For weeks, Eastern State is transformed into a nightmare carnival, where the line between performance and genuine haunting blurs. Guests pay to be chased, cornered, and terrified inside the very walls where real men once suffered. The event has drawn millions since its creation, turning the decayed prison into an economic powerhouse of fear. But with success has come controversy. Historians argue over whether such attractions dishonor the prison's painful past. Is it exploitation to turn a site of human misery into an amusement park of horror? Or is it a way to keep history alive, to ensure that Eastern State is never forgotten? Critics bristle at the spectacle, but others argue that the fusion of history and haunting reflects the prison's true duality: part monument, part ghost story. And still, the crowds keep coming. By day, they listen to audio tours narrated by historians and actors, walking quietly through ruined chapels and collapsed blocks. By night, they scream and laugh, chased by monsters through the same corridors where prisoners once whispered to themselves in madness. No matter the debate, Eastern State has become a mecca of dark tourism, its legacy carved as deeply into popular culture as into its own walls. For some, the attraction is entertainment. For others, it is pilgrimage, a chance to confront the weight of history in the most visceral way. But for everyone who enters, one truth remains constant: the building itself does not care. The walls still stand, the shadows still stretch, and the whispers, whether born of imagination or something more, still drift through the air long after the actors have gone home. Eastern State has found its second life, but it is a life inseparable from dread. The fortress has become both museum and nightmare, a place where the past is not buried but performed, night after night, for those brave enough to step inside. Eastern State today is more than stone and steel. It has become a mirror, reflecting not just the lives once trapped inside its walls, but the soul of America itself. Every corridor, every cracked door, every shadowed cell is a reminder of the nation's struggle between progress and cruelty, between justice and vengeance. The prison was born from reformist dreams, but it lived as a place of torment. It punished, it brutalized, it haunted, and in doing so, it revealed truths that America still wrestles with today. Step inside its walls, and you feel history pressing down. The silence is not empty. It is layered with echoes of reformers who believed isolation would heal, of guards who carried keys with trembling hands, of prisoners who begged for mercy and never found it. The whispers in the corridors are not just ghost stories. They are memory itself, refusing to fade. The sound of a knock on a cell door, the murmur of voices just out of reach, the distant footsteps in a deserted block. These are not simply hauntings. They are the residue of human lives, imprinted on stone. Historians debate what Eastern State means. Was it a noble attempt at rehabilitation that collapsed under its own weight? Or was it always destined to be a monument to suffering? What cannot be denied is the power the prison still holds. Its story is not locked in the past. It is alive in the present, whispered to every visitor who dares to walk its halls. And this leads to the most unsettling question of all. What is truly more frightening? The possibility that the ghosts of Eastern State still wander its blocks? Or the realization that we created this place, that human ambition and human cruelty built a machine designed to break minds in the name of salvation? The prison is haunted, yes, but perhaps the most terrifying spirit it holds is our own appetite for punishment. Eastern State does not rest. Its stones still breathe. Its corridors still whisper. Guides can close the gates each night. Actors can play their parts. Tourists can laugh nervously at the darkness. But the presence remains, heavy and undeniable. It is a prison that outlived its prisoners. A ruin that outlasted its purpose. A monument that refuses to be silent. And so Eastern State waits. It waits for footsteps in its halls, for the sound of voices that keep its story alive. It waits for those who will walk through its gates and feel, in their bones, that history is not finished here. Because the truth is simple and chilling. Eastern State Penitentiary is not just a ruin. It is a presence. It remembers. It breathes. It whispers. And it is still waiting for the next story to unfold, perhaps yours.